Good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today on multifamily housing, a key to New Hampshire's future. I'm Ernesto Burden. I'm the publisher of New Hampshire Business Review. Today's webinar is sponsored by Sheehan Finney and New Hampshire Housing. And we will not delay. We're just going to dive right in because we have a lot of folks joining us today. We have two great speakers, and we're tackling a topic that remains critical to New Hampshire in so many ways, from quality of life to workforce. So let's dive right in. Our two speakers today are Rob Dappis, Executive Director of New Hampshire Housing, and Greg Chakmakis, a shareholder at Sheehan Finney. And we're going to begin with Rob to give us an overview of the challenges and the opportunities that multifamily housing presents to New Hampshire's housing future. Rob, welcome.
Thanks so much, Ernesto. I appreciate it. And I'm going to share my screen here so that folks online can see what we're looking at. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about multifamily housing. And first, I'll just provide an overview of New Hampshire's housing market with some of the latest data and information, and then talk a little bit about multifamily housing's role in solving some of the challenges that we're experiencing. So without further ado, just a quick sort of word of orientation for people who aren't familiar with New Hampshire Housing. We're an independent, self-supporting corporation created by state law in 1981. We're not a state agency. We don't receive operating money from the state. We do have a board of directors that's appointed by the governor and approved by the executive council. And we've got a mission to promote, finance, and support housing solutions for the people of New Hampshire. We do that through a wide range of programs. And I think the numbers on this slide give you an idea of some of the outcomes that were achieved just in the past year. Through our work with a wide range of partners all across the state, including for-profit and nonprofit developers, lenders, realtors, municipalities, and so on. So to get into the data, I like to start by providing some context, and I expect that many members of the audience will have seen some version of this slide and these numbers before, because they come from a statewide housing needs assessment that New Hampshire Housing conducted or commissioned almost 2 years ago now. We do it about every 10 years. And so we charged the economists and consultants and demographers who were working on this study with projecting what the housing need was in the state today and what it was going to be based on household formation, immigration, migration, and things like that in the next couple of decades. And what they found, you can see in that left-hand column on the graphic, is that by 2030, in order to achieve balanced housing market, we would need 60,000 new units of housing, and by 2040 we need about 88,000 or almost 90,000. A balanced housing market generally defined as 5% rental vacancy rate and roughly 6 months of supply for sale housing. More sort of conversationally, I think it's the kind of rental market that many of us have experienced at some point in our lifetime, where there was sort of power balance between the renter and the landlord, or the seller and the buyer, was more in line with historical norms. And I think most people who have been on any side of a transaction in the housing market in the last 3 or 4 years would agree that we're some ways off from that historical norm. The third number that I like to highlight with this sort of introductory slide is that one that's in the bullet points, the 36%. That's the percentage that we would have to increase housing production relative to recent permit levels in order to achieve those numbers of 60,000 and 90,000. I like to use that number because I think 60,000, 90,000, those are some pretty intimidating numbers. And sometimes they have the effect, especially if you're somebody who has a mortgage that you can afford. Maybe you were fortunate to lock in a low interest rate, and it feels like the housing market is working for you. And you hear these sort of frightening numbers, and it makes you want to run away and bury your head in the sand. And so I think, honestly, that's one reason why we haven't made more progress on this issue, particularly at the local level in some areas. But 36% increase relative to current levels of construction is really, I think, quite achievable. And we've got a couple of slides just to show what that would look like. This one is my favorite, and it goes all the way back to 1980 in terms of the number of building permits issued. And this is from Census Bureau data, so national data, which is not perfect. It's not as good as our friends at the State Office of Planning and Development, who do a 100% survey of municipalities, but still gives us a good idea, and it's got current information through 2023. You can see we had a huge building boom in the 1980s, another one that that for those of us who were around at that time felt like a huge building boom in the early 2000s leading up to the Great Recession. And then really since the Great Recession, extraordinarily depressed levels of new home permitting and construction, really something low levels of housing production that we hadn't seen in decades. I think what's interesting here is that you see in the late teens, 2010s, that the demand was there. The market saw it and tried to respond to the demand. But you can see that that market response has been somewhat anemic, and that we've kind of struggled to get over 5 or 6 thousand building permits per year, which is not all that great compared to what we used to achieve in the 80s, to some extent the 90s and the early 2000s. For the last few years, we've been telling this story as a pretty simple story, which is that the market has been trying to respond, and that regulatory barriers, primarily at the local level, have constrained the market from doing that. And so that's why you don't see the response that you probably would have projected based on Econ 101 if you took that. Now it's a little bit more nuanced. I think regulatory barriers, and particularly at the local level, continue to be primary constraint. We've seen more in terms of housing that has been permitted but is not moving forward because of costs, either construction costs or borrowing costs related to interest rate increases. And I'll talk more about rates in a minute. Another slide on building permit activity, and this one is just sort of projecting out and showing you what we would need to get to. So that 36% number, what would that look like if we were to build enough to achieve 30,000 units, or sorry, to achieve a balanced housing market by 2030? It's close to 8,000 homes per year. And you can see this is actually from the state data, the Office of Planning and Development. We were kind of at a high watermark of about 5,700 units. So we've still got a ways to go. Multifamily definitely has to be a part of that. And I think I'll talk a little bit about that. And then Greg will show an example of a project that I think is the type of project that can help us achieve unit production numbers more along the lines of where we need to be. Just a word on cost. And again, I know this is a familiar story to many members of our audience, but I wanted to share it partly because we just finished and published on our website our statewide rent survey, through which we survey, in cooperation with the UNH Survey Center, thousands of market rate units. This is not subsidized or affordable apartments across the state, to see what's going on with their rents. And if you follow national news, you might have heard that rents have begun to soften, certainly in certain markets where the market was very frothy and got really overheated, in Austin, Texas, and Nashville, Tennessee, and they built a ton of new housing relative to their existing inventory. And so market rates in those areas really have come down quite a bit. So we were very curious to see this year if we would be seeing that in New Hampshire. And the answer is not really. We reported last year an 11.4% increase in median gross rent around the state. This year, the gross rent increase was closer to 4%, and there's a couple of ingredients of that. The actual rents being charged went up more, but because gross rent is a statistic that includes median cost of utilities, utilities actually came down a bit over the past year. So a slowing in the rate of increase in terms of market rents, but certainly not a decrease that we're seeing. And to the degree that market rents are softening, it's making a difference at the high end. It's good news for the economy. It's good news for the workforce, but it may not make much of a difference in terms of the housing stability of the people who are sort of struggling with these increased in rents and sort of at the margin of the rental markets. I was curious, as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about inflation, because inflation's been all over the news, and I plugged in what it would look like if rents had increased at the same rate as the Consumer Price Index, which is sort of the most prevalent measure of inflation. And we would see market rents for a two-bedroom, so instead of $1,833, we would see them at $1,650 in the middle of this year. And I think that's a pretty good indicator. Everybody knows inflation has been a problem in the last few years, but inflation in rent and housing has been an even bigger problem. We like to talk about rental housing and single family and for sale housing market together because they're so interconnected. And so certainly the increase in rents we've seen is partly caused by the difficulty that people are having achieving homeownership at the point in their lives when they normally would, largely driven by a lack of inventory. and we continue to see that. So as I said earlier, 6 months of inventory is sort of considered balanced, and we've seen it bouncing around below 2 months for several years now, and that has a predictable impact in terms of the single family median sales price. I'll give a shout out here to New Hampshire Public Radio, and they spoke with Joni McIntyre, the president of the New Hampshire Association of Realtors, which published their most recent median home price data last week. And you can see it there, $530,000, not the all-time peak, but very close to it, and a enormous increase of 56% since July 2020. And I did the same analysis. So if home prices had increased at the rate of the CPI, we'd be looking at $416,000 for a median home, and it's over $100,000 north of that. There are some sort of cautious signs to reasons to be cautiously optimistic, and so inventory has grown a little bit. The days on market has picked up a little bit, but Joni McIntyre gave some, I think, insightful comments about why that's not really an indicator of a sea change or a real coming changing of the tide in the homeownership market. It continues to be very, very tight and very difficult for people to achieve home ownership. Okay, and then I promised I would talk about rates, and here I will. I'm hoping that we can update this slide soon with a lower rate at the far right, because we've been telling the story, and everybody knows it, that for the past couple of years, since rates skyrocketed and the monthly payment necessary to buy a median priced home has increased, as you can see, $900, which is something that very few families in New Hampshire can afford. We've all also probably heard the news that the Fed is bringing rates down in all likelihood at their September meeting. And so while that doesn't directly impact home mortgage rates, it's related, and they sort of track together. And so mortgage rates have already begun to drop a bit. And in fact, New Hampshire Housing offers a number of loan programs through our lender partners. And you can see on New Hampshire Housing's website now that we have rates in the mid fives for some of those loans. And so that's a significant improvement. I think what we're all curious to see is whether the coming decrease in mortgage rates that we all sort of expect will improve affordability. A lot of people are on the sidelines because of the so-called interest rate lock-in effect, where they would never sell their home at 3% interest rate and buy a new one at 6 or 7%, unless they had some compelling life reason that they had to. That sort of gets a little bit less pronounced when the rates are at 5 or 6%. It's a significant psychological barrier, I think. The issue is there's also a lot of buyers who are on the sidelines. And again, that goes back to the pressure that has been on the rental market. And so as more buyers and sellers come off the sidelines, and we have little doubt that transactions will increase as rates drop. Whether that contributes to affordability is still anybody's guess. I would say the fact that rates have begun to come down a little bit, and inventory has gone up a little bit, and yet prices continue to increase, and we're up about 10% year on year in terms of median home prices. It's not terribly encouraging that lower rates will bring about greater affordability. And sometimes you'll hear elected officials say that that's the key to affordability. I'm sorry to tell you and them that it probably isn't. Although I will say the part of dropping interest rates that I'm most excited about, that I think is most likely to have an impact on the housing market, both rental and for sale, is making projects feasible. So I mentioned earlier that anecdotally and to some extent in our sort of firsthand experience, we've seen projects that have stalled because of both increasing construction costs and increasing borrowing costs. As those borrowing costs come down, more of those projects may become feasible, and we're really hoping that that's the case. Okay, now I just have a couple more slides, less than 5 minutes to talk to you about New Hampshire Housing's programs and how we're working again with partners to make a difference in this space. And I think some good news that gives us reason for, again, cautious optimism is the uptick in multifamily construction across the state in the last couple of years as a market response to the increased demand. In fact, as I was looking at the Census Bureau data about the types of buildings that the permits were in, about a third of the units that have been permitted in the last 2 years have been in multifamily buildings, which is higher than is historically typical and certainly higher than is sort of reflected in the current housing stock in New Hampshire. So that's very good news because these kinds of projects are essential for us meeting the housing demand and getting closer to a balanced housing market. But there's a couple of caveats, and one I mentioned before, these projects that have been stalled because of increasing construction costs and borrowing costs. In fact, the supply chain challenges that we read so much about earlier in the pandemic sort of recovery, and we also used car prices and electronics go through the roof because of the lack of chips. Still, there are still some supply chain bottlenecks in terms of new housing and new construction, specifically with respect to electrical equipment that have continued to really be a challenge for developers and builders. So that sort of threatens to impede the momentum that we see on multifamily construction. And then second, I would say the government funding, the various types of public funding and financing that are necessary in order to make affordable housing feasible, which is what is most needed by the people who are sort of most affected by the tightness in the rental market. There are some reasons to be concerned that that is drying up. And so a lot of that funding came through the American Rescue Plan, which is, of course, more or less deployed and spent at this point. Also, in the state of New Hampshire here, we received 2 historic appropriations to the Affordable Housing Fund, which is a fund that is administered by New Hampshire Housing and is used in conjunction with federal tax credits and bond funding to make projects feasible. And so in the last 2 biennial budgets, there were appropriations of $25 to $35 million, which we have put to work. And I think all indications are that this could be a pretty challenging budget year in the state legislature. And so we very much hope the new governor and the legislators see fit to make appropriations that will allow us to continue to work with partners to create new housing that the state so desperately needs. I also want to mention the Invest in H HOP grant program, Municipal Planning and Zoning grant program, which we've been administering under contract and in partnership with New Hampshire Department of Business and Economic Affairs. And so I mentioned earlier that the biggest impediment to the market meeting the demand was regulatory barriers. And we recognize that it's a complicated space. There's a lot of municipalities that see the need for additional housing, but have trouble with the process of updating zoning codes so that they can create reasonable opportunities for housing of the type that you're going to see from Greg in a few minutes, but preserving what it is that they love about the community and avoiding any sort of undue burden on their services and all that. So our team has been working again with BEA and actually also with Plan New Hampshire and UNH Cooperative Extension to administer this program that has granted almost $3 million and with a few million left to spend to help municipalities hire consultants who can do outreach and write recommended changes to the zoning code that they can bring to city council or town meeting or whatever their process is for adopting changes. And so we're very encouraged by the progress of that program and appreciate the partnership with BEA. And then another one, which is actually we're talking about real money here, and this is sort of a bright spot in what otherwise is sort of a rather bleak picture in terms of the funding available for multifamily housing in the next year or two, is a Solar for All program. As this was funded as part of the the Federal Inflation Reduction Act. It's administered at the federal level by the Environmental Protection Agency. We supported a statewide application led by the New Hampshire Department of Energy. New Hampshire was awarded $43.5 million, and about $22 to $24 million of that will be deployed through a New Hampshire Housing Run program that will help multifamily properties put solar panels on to reduce their operating costs and be more financially and environmentally sustainable. So we're very excited. We are still waiting on EPA for a few things in order to be able to pull this program out, but we're hoping for early in calendar year 2025. And then I think this is my last slide. I just wanted to quickly highlight state legislative activity because it feels like the session is over. There's actually a few bills that are still making their way to the governor's desk. But there's a lot of energy in the state legislature around housing this past session. Unfortunately, some of the bills that I think would have made the biggest difference, particularly, uh, bills that would have uh, limited the degree to which municipalities can require excessive lot sizes in all of their residential areas, some changes to the laws requiring municipalities to permit accessory dwelling units and duplexes were killed in the legislature, but still some very promising funding bills that or regulatory bills that did pass, including a significant one relating to the conversion of existing buildings to small multifamily buildings. The state fire marshal worked with us on that and helped to pass a very sort of common sense reform and some sort of much needed updating to the septic standards that the Department of Environmental Services helped to make happen. So hope very much that in the coming legislative session, as I said, funding will be key question, but also taking another look at options to lower regulatory barriers so that the market can meet the demand. Because while subsidy and funding is an essential part of making new housing happen, particularly multifamily, it's never going to be quite enough. So I think that is it for me, and I'm happy to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Greg Chakmakis. Greg, are you there?
Thank
Oh,
you.
I have not stopped sharing my screen, have I? Yeah.
And my name is Greg Chakmakis. I'm a shareholder at She & Finney. The focus of my practice is on the preservation and production of affordable housing, and I primarily represent developers in that effort. So I'm going to kind of dovetail my presentation off of Rob's. I thought Rob kind of set up the issue in that we have kind of a supply crisis for housing in New Hampshire, and especially on the multifamily side. And I'm going to take some time to provide an overview of one of the tools to kind of help meet that need, and that's the low-income housing tax credit program. So I'll give an overview of that program. I'll discuss the two different types of credits under that program, the allocation process, and then the players to help get those deals put together. So if you could advance to the next slide. So the low-income housing tax credit program is a federal program created in 1986. It's the federal government's primary policy tool for the development of affordable rental housing. The tax credits themselves are awarded to developers to offset the cost of constructing rental housing in exchange for reserving a fraction of rent-restricted units for lower-income households. The tax credit is claimed over 10 years once the project is placed in service, meaning it's completed and available to be rented. These tax credits are typically sold to investors who are mostly large financial institutions in exchange for equity financing. And the beauty of the program is that the equity raised reduces the debt that would otherwise be required. And that lowers the financing costs, and it makes these projects financially feasible to charge lower rents and expand the supply of affordable housing. And keep in mind, this is kind of a high-level overview of the program. It's administered by the IRS, found in Section 42 of the tax code. It's lengthy and complex, but I do kind of want to give an overview of some of the basic components. One being that there's two types of credits. There's a 9% credit that's based on a state's population, and it delivers up to a 70% subsidy for a project, and that's based on the present value of the 10-year credit stream. And there's also a 4% credit, which is not based on the state's population. Instead, the 4% credit is unlocked when a project finances 50% of its cost with tax-exempt bonds, and that delivers up to a 30% subsidy. A bit on the allocation, how these credits are allocated. First, it starts at the federal level. The federal government allocates it to states according to population. In 2023, the allocation authority for that 9% credit was equal to $2.75 per person. And for certain small states, there's a floor of an allocation that a state will get. Allocations on the 4% side are not limited by population. Instead, they're limited by what's called the state's volume cap. Once awarded to the states, in New Hampshire Housing is the state allocating agency that allocates these credits to developers. And they do that in accordance with federally required but state-created qualified allocation plans. These qualified allocation plans are kind of the rules for the road, and they must give priority to the project that serves the lowest income households that remain affordable for the longest period of time. States can decide and do decide to set allocation priorities and to place additional requirements on awardees. Some examples of that would be longer affordability periods and deeper income targeting. And the projects that are allocated the tax credits are required to meet tests that restrict both the amount of rent that may be charged and the income of eligible tenants. We could advance to the next slide. This is a typical ownership structure for a low-income housing tax credit project. They are set up as either limited partnerships or limited liability companies, with the developer serving as the sole owner of the general partner entity and basically managing the day-to-day affairs. On the other side, we have the equity investor who's putting their equity into the deal in exchange for the tax benefits. They own a large ownership share of the entity in order to be allocated all of the federal tax benefits, but they play mostly a passive role. You can advance to the next slide. Developers are a diverse group. There's for-profit developers, nonprofit developers, public housing authorities, and joint ventures with a combination of those parties who all participate in the program. If once given an award, they're going to sell those credits for equity investment in the real estate project, and the sale of credits occurs within that partnership. That legally binds the developer and the investor to satisfy federal tax requirements that the credit claimant have an ownership interest in the underlying property. And in addition to the credits, they also invest for other tax benefits like losses and deductions. And I think a unique feature of this that's unlike other market rate real estate development is that the investors aren't looking to get a return or to produce income. I think their main investment focus is to get the tax benefits. They're looking for credits to offset tax liabilities, and credit pricing varies, but it's generally between the mid 80s to the low 90s in cents per credit. And one of the factors that impacts pricing is that a lot of these investors are large institutional banks that must get certain Community Reinvestment Act credit. So if there's CRA on the deal, you might get higher pricing for your credits, which means more equity for the project, which is a good thing. And typically, the tax credits don't provide all of the financing for the entire development. They'll provide a portion of it, and then it has to be combined with other resources like conventional loans, soft loans, and grant financing. Can go to the next slide. So to avoid putting everyone to sleep talking about section 42, we put some pictures into the slideshow to kind of give you an example of what a low-income housing tax project looks like. This example comes to you from Catch Neighborhood Housing. They closed on this development about a year ago, and I think it's pretty close to coming online. I think December of this year is when it may be available to start being leased up. But as you can see from these pictures, if you're driving by, you wouldn't know the difference between a low-income housing tax credit project and a market rate multifamily project. And typically communities are very happy with how they come out once they're placed in service. And if you'll scan through, you can see a couple pictures of the project going through the development process. So here's just some kind of details about this project. Again, this is Sheep Davis Apartments in Concord. It's a new construction, 48 units. As I mentioned previously, the qualified allocation plan awards developers points for deeper income targeting, and this project took advantage of that. 11 of the units are rented to households earning at or below 50% of area median income. 25 of the units are rented to households earning at or below 60% of area median income. And then 12 of the units are market rate units. They're rented to households earning above 60, but less than 140% of area median income. And in exchange for these credits, the developer has placed an affordability restriction on the project that will keep it affordable for a 60-year period. And again, this is, I wanted to kind of give you a snapshot. All of these projects don't get built with a lot of different resources. The low-income housing tax credit, while the primary financing mechanism to get these deals completed, it's not the only one. And typically we have to layer in multiple sources of financing to get the deal to work. On this deal, there was a typical construction loan, a permanent loan, and then there were, and Rob had mentioned this in his presentation, there was a Invest NH program administered by BEA that was offering basically additional subsidy to close gaps in projects during the COVID period when inflation and construction prices were rapidly increasing. So this kind of helped fill that gap. The way it works on deferred payment loans is unlike your permanent loan where it amortizes each month and you have to make a required hard debt payment. A deferred payment loan, the payment schedule is only required if there's available cash flow to pay the loan down. And these projects, since the rents are capped, they're not able to carry as much amortizing hard debt. So the deferred payment loans play a big role in filling kind of development gaps and making the projects possible. And that you can advance to the next slide. And that's kind of, I went pretty quickly, but that's the low-income housing tax credit program in a high-level overview. And I think Rob and I are happy to kind of take any questions you might have about multifamily development.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Rob. We'll jump into questions as soon as Rob comes back. We have a few from the audience, and I have some questions here based on the material that you all presented. But let's start with the audience questions. First question. I think that at least some of the regional planning commissions have made recommendations to each of their member towns as to how many new housing units each town should enable as the town's share of the regional need for new housing. Do you think this is a worthwhile exercise?
Yeah, and Ernesto, I jumped the gun a little bit by answering that in the chat box, but I'll say again, yes, I do think it is. And I think the regional housing needs assessments, every one of the regional planning commissions has done a regional housing needs assessment, which breaks down sort of as best they can estimate the housing need by municipality and estimates what it would look like to achieve a balanced housing market for that town. Those can be a great tool for local planning boards and other housing committees and decision makers. We'll say it's a little bit complicated when you look at it. It's not just one number, and so it's helpful to either talk to a planning somebody from the RPC or a professional planner, which some municipalities have on staff and others don't, to help sort of put it in context and understand what it might look like to achieve those numbers. But by all means, check them out, and they're a great resource.
Okay, and then are ADUs included in the building permit data that you had talked about?
So they are, and maybe just very quickly, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, sometimes called granny flats. These are apartments that are built onto or inside of or next to single-family homes, which are now, by state law, municipalities are required to allow those in any area that allows single-family homes. So yes, they would be included in that permit data. We don't think it's not necessarily broken out, and we don't think it's a huge part of new construction, but every little bit makes a difference. And I'll say that when you look sort of across the country at some have also had sort of ADU law reform and have even higher costs than what we experience here in New Hampshire, you do see ADUs becoming more prevalent and making more of a difference in terms of housing supply.
Okay, we had a question that came in via email ahead of the presentation. why are there so few 3 and 4 bedroom options? And I guess maybe the questioner means within multifamily housing, but maybe also just generally, why are there are fewer of those kind of options? And I guess I would add my own follow-up to that question is, when we're looking at all of the multifamily units that are being built now, do many of those contain 3 or 4 bedroom options?
I can take a crack at it, but Greg, you work with developers too, so do you want to sort of say what you're
I'll
hearing?
start it off and maybe you can finish it up. But I think to answer the question, generally, there are not a lot of 3 and 4 bedroom in the Y type projects, that the low income housing tax credit projects that we work on. They're mostly 1 and 2 bedroom units. And I think one of the primary reasons for that is market demand. I know all of these projects do market studies before they get developed to ensure that the absorption rates of the units are sufficient and the project makes sense in the area it's being built. And I think that drives a lot of the decision making in terms of including 3 or 4 bedrooms or not to include them. And for whatever reason, those market studies, I think, are dictating that the 1 and 2 bedrooms are in demand and 3 and 4 bedrooms are harder to fill.
Yeah, and I would add, I think what those market studies are finding is that there's fewer and fewer large families. And so the demand still exists, but it's less common to have a family with, 6 people in it that would need a larger apartment. We actually have a study coming out towards the end of this month, so like in the next 2 weeks, that looks at school enrollment relative to new housing construction. And I think, refreshes some research that's been done in the past in terms of how many school children typically move in when you have a new 30-unit apartment building or something. And it's just, I think we see it in our own towns and in our own lives and in the school enrollment patterns across the state, is that there's fewer families with 2, 3, or 4 kids.
Okay. Looking at multifamily housing broadly, it seems like there is a lot of different kind of housing within that category. And maybe you could just give a little bit of clarity around what we're talking about in terms of different types of multifamily housing.
Sure, I think that's exactly right. And so I think it's important to understand that what you see in Nashua or Manchester that's working in that community and in that built environment is not what we talk about when we look at multifamily that's being built in Bristol, New Hampshire, or Bethlehem, or other places that have seen some good new construction and really nice homes being created in multifamily housing. Generally, what we say is anything from a sort of 3 or 4 unit home multifamily to as large as a couple hundred units. I will say that the numbers, some people may have heard the term missing middle, and it's pretty hard to make the numbers work on a new construction project that's larger than new homes, but smaller than, say, 30 or 40, just because overhead, the building costs and building code requirements and things like that start to get more cumbersome, but you don't have kind of the economies of scale. So it runs the gamut, but I think what you see the most of is sort of, small condo developments, maybe some duplexes at one end of the spectrum, and then 30, 40, up to 100 unit, depending on the sort of urban environment and the amenities and things like that. Sort of.
Okay, and Greg, any additional perspectives on that, sort of from what you see developers working with?
No, I agree with Rob's answer. I think there's some variety. You can have garden style multifamily to in more urban settings. You go higher up with podium parking, and I think that's kind of a discussion that every developer has with each community as they're going through the entitlement process and trying to get their approvals and making sure that the project is going to match the aesthetic of the community and the needs of the community. So I think there's a lot of variation there. And I know developers work hard during their approval process to try to bring a project that fits the community they're entering.
Okay, we have now a bunch of questions have come through, so I'm going to turn back to the audience questions here. Who pays the taxes of the building to the towns? And I'm guessing that this applies to the projects that you were talking about, Greg.
Yeah, so the owner does pay property taxes. So the owner of the project pays property taxes to the municipality. The New Hampshire statute provides for essentially like a special valuation mechanism for low-income housing tax credit projects. Since the rents are restricted, there's a formula in place that's specific to these projects. But I think it's important to underscore all of these projects do pay taxes, property taxes to their local municipalities.
Okay. What happens if a resident income rises above the threshold? How often is the income test evaluated?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on whether you're a fully affordable, 100% affordable project, or if you're a mixed income project. If you're a mixed income project, I believe the testing is still done annually. And the key is the initial occupancy of that tenant is when you're first certifying and deemed a qualified tenant for purposes of complying with those low-income housing tax credit rules. And then if it's a mixed-use project and you're testing annually and that tenant's income rises, I think it's above 140% of area median income. That tenant is no longer income qualified for the project, but they're allowed to remain. They're not required to leave or anything like that. But the owner of the project is required to rent the next available unit and deem the next available unit an affordable unit and rent it at the 60% AMI level.
Is there any assistance for homeowners willing to add an ADU to their property to help reduce need for housing stock?
There's not a program that offers financing. I mean, it's certainly worth, talking to your local bank and I think in terms of sort of technical assistance, if your municipality has planning professionals on staff, you might just ask them about the process. But no, there's a few municipalities around the country that have introduced ADU financing programs, and it's certainly kind of an interesting model. Right now, that kind of thing doesn't exist in New Hampshire, and I think that is one reason why you don't see them sort of being adopted at scale, is because it's expensive. All kinds of construction are expensive, and it doesn't always sort of phrase out or add the kind of value to your home that would support financing on the market.
How this goes back to something we were talking about before, that community's fair share of affordable housing. How is that determined? What are some of the factors that go into that?
Somebody from the Regional Planning Commission would probably be able to answer that better than I can, but I believe that they look at each individual, if not the municipality, then at least the region and sort of the demographics and projections relative to that region, and do their best to estimate what the housing needs are, looking out for the next few years or decade.
Okay. It appears that condominium ownership is not part of most of these new multifamily developments. What's happened to condos?
Well, I'll speak to the low-income housing tax credit program is, I don't want to say it's the only game in town, but it's certainly the dominant force in multifamily housing development and one of the only resources available. And that program is set up as multifamily rental housing. So it doesn't allow for or contemplate a tenant kind of ownership component. So I think that's just a feature of that program. I think there's probably room for and space to further promote home ownership, and if that's through duplexes or condominium form of ownership, I definitely would be supportive of it, and I think there's probably a huge demand for it in New Hampshire.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I think that cannot be done with the federal low-income housing tax credit, and that's per federal law. However, there are a lot of opportunities to increase production of condominiums and small homes through local zoning codes. And I think probably the reason that you don't see very many of those things getting built outside of a few cities and places on the seacoast is because many municipalities have made it, if not illegal, impractical to create condominiums with large, if you need 40,000 square feet for one unit and then 20,000 for your next unit, you're going to build single family homes that sell for maybe $700,000-800,000. You can't build condos when you have those kinds of lot size requirements. And there are ample opportunities to reform those lot size requirements, whether or not you have public water and sewer, but especially if you do, such that we see the market creating more condominiums and more housing options for people who want to downsize, or seniors, or small families.
And just to add on that quickly too, I think the market conditions will produce luxury condominiums and high-end condominium homes. I think what's missing is, because of the high interest rate environment and the cost of materials and the cost of labor, that producing condominium ownership style developments really can't happen with the current market conditions, absent some form of subsidy or some sort of flexibility in the zoning requirements to make the development financially feasible.
Is there some degree, this was actually a question I had jotted down earlier, is there some degree to which the development of that luxury market does end up opening up space elsewhere? Like, I live here in Manchester, and I think that we saw during the pandemic and afterwards, many of the sort of more sort of average cost rental units going to folks who were trying to move up here, who probably would have gotten someplace much more expensive if they were available. And so does that stuff, do those luxury units open those kind of spaces up again for lower income folks?
You want to say it together, Greg, on three? I think the answer is yes.
More supply is good, yeah.
Yeah, filtering, it's a supply problem first and foremost, and filtering is what it's called sort of in the industry, but yes, more housing at the higher end, while it's not as immediate an effect as creating more affordable housing, does help people, middle class people and lower income people, to differing degrees in different parts of the state. And certainly if you're in a vacation hotbed where a lot of those new homes are second homes, that's going to sort of mute the effect. If you're in a place that attracts a lot of people from out of state because it's just super high amenities, it might not have the same filtering effect, at least not immediately, that other parts of the state would. But by and large, it definitely has a beneficial effect on the housing market when you create more housing at any price point.
Okay, this is a question directed to Greg. Do you see Manchester making changes to improve accessory dwelling and zoning regulations?
Well, it's a timely question. Manchester's going through a zoning ordinance overhaul or revision, and I know they're hosting a lot of listening sessions around the city right now. So I think it's a great opportunity for the city to have that conversation with the community and see what would work best for Manchester. But I'm optimistic that going through that process would yield some changes we need to make multifamily housing more feasible in the city.
Okay, I have two questions here to roll together, I think. One is, how difficult is it to develop multifamily housing where there is no water and sewer? And two, should there be a push for legislation in the state to fund water and sewer build out to help towns that want housing development or woo developers?
You want to answer the first one, Greg? Or
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's another timely question. We have a developer who's wrestling with that issue head on in the Upper Valley. So I think water and sewer is critical infrastructure that can be the difference between the project moving forward or it not happening at all. So it's one of those kind of critical threshold issues that a lot of developers face. And if the infrastructure is not there and you're trying to build it out, it can render the project financially infeasible, and it can prevent housing that's desperately needed from getting built. So legislation to help on that front would be welcome.
Yeah, and I would just want to qualify that by saying that multifamily, and particularly small multifamily, can be done without water and sewer. So Greg's absolutely right that it's a lot easier and financially easier when you've got water and sewer, but it's not a reason to say, well, I guess multifamily is not for us. I think you can still work to meet the housing needs of your town, which most likely involves some degree of multifamily housing, no matter how small the town is, whether or not you have existing water and sewer. In terms of legislation that would expand water and sewer to allow for more multifamily, I think it's an interesting conversation to have. Obviously, the funding picture is always going to be constrained, and so whether that's the best investment. I mean, we have a lot of areas in New Hampshire that are currently served by water and sewer and are zoned for single family housing only. And so those areas could probably be more financially productive, making more tax revenues for those municipalities if they were zoned to allow at least small multifamily. And so I think looking at interventions like that, which could be done at the state or local level before investing a ton of money into water and sewer expansions that are going to cost a lot of money for those municipalities to keep up over the coming years. I think there's a balance to be struck there, but I'm not sure that expanding water and sewer needs to be the highest priority.
How do we go about changing the attitude that many communities have about development to meet the reality of the community's needs? Have you seen any success stories here?
I think,
Greg, you work with some great developers,
yeah, we have a lot of very talented and passionate development partners who are doing great work across the state. I tried to highlight one of them in the presentation with Catch Neighborhood Housing, and their soon to be completed project in Concord. And I think the pictures kind of speak for themselves. I think there's a lot of myths and misconceptions about affordable housing development. And I would encourage anyone to see if they could take a tour of a multifamily project that's financed with the low-income housing tax credit program, and talk with folks on the positive impacts those projects have in communities. And I think it's just an education process that would help to dispel some myths, because I think these projects on the whole are largely beneficial for the communities that have them.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of a storytelling exercise too. And there are some owners and developers of affordable housing who are doing a great job of this. Lakes Region Community Developers has done some cases of affordable housing profiles in the Laconia Daily Sun that tells a story of people who move into multifamily housing and what their journey is like, and the way that they're finding ways to contribute to the economy and raise a family and things like that. So Catch, who Greg highlighted, they've created materials that show all the companies in the Concord area that their residents work at. And it's basically like a who's who of every corporation in the greater Concord region. I think it's important for people to understand that whatever stigma it is that they're hanging on to about affordable housing is probably outdated. These places, as Greg pointed out, they look like regular apartment buildings, and they feel and function very much like them, and the people who are living in them are not any different from you or me. So it's a long and slow process, but I think it is understanding those stories that's going to make the difference over time.
Greg, can you use these credits if you were just improving an existing structure of like 2 to 4 units?
You can use it to substantially rehabilitate existing units. Legally, you can use it for a project as small as 2 to 4 units. I think practically, you're going to have a hard time getting equity investment into a project of that size. I think the equity investors are looking for a little bit more scale to invest into projects, because compliance with the program and getting it off the ground is a lengthy and complex project. And there's a lot of cost that goes into it. And typically a 2 to 4 unit project can't support kind of the costs associated with it. But you can certainly rehabilitate existing projects with low income housing tax credits. And I had mentioned earlier that there's 2 different types, a 9% and a 4%. And typically a 4% low income housing tax credit is a good candidate for a substantial rehab on a little bit larger scale project.
So have you seen many LIHTC projects in New Hampshire built with passive house performance standards? If so, are there any benefits to securing the funding tax credits using this standard? These projects are gaining momentum in Massachusetts.
Yes, we have seen a few passive house developments in New Hampshire, and I think one of the big benefits is it keeps the operating expenses for the project down, which makes them more financially feasible in the long run. Rob, you probably have better data on New Hampshire's portfolio, but I'm pretty sure there's several passive house projects in.
We have seen several. There's one in Guilford and one in Lebanon, one in Rochester. So it's increasing in sort of its popularity, I think, and the price premium has definitely come down since the technology was sort of introduced maybe 10 or 15 years ago in the US. So yeah, it's exciting to see that. It is not only good for the environment, sort of good for operating costs, but really hearing great things about the resident experience in terms of indoor air quality and comfort. So yeah, it's a great trend in construction, and we do we don't require it, but we incentivize developers who feel like they can meet that benchmark and are going for that certification. They get a leg up in the competition for tax credits.
Okay, well, we have a bunch of questions left and not much time, so I'm going to try and get to a couple more here, and we'll have to do this again because obviously the demand for the information that you guys are presenting is tremendous. How much has property and builders risk insurance premiums and deductibles been affected the affordability in building and maintaining more multifamily buildings here in New Hampshire? And parenthetically, typically wood frame on podium.
Yeah, I think property insurance is rising premiums for property insurance is a national issue, and I know HUD held like a listening session on ways to try to address that nationally. I think it's in New Hampshire, it's a problem, but probably not to the same extent as some Sunbelt states or other states where natural disasters are more prevalent. But I definitely think it puts kind of downward pressure on affordable housing developments because your rents are restricted, and if you have skyrocketing property insurance premiums, there's no way to kind of adjust for that and account for that as your project's going along. So it's definitely something that developers keep a close eye on, and they try to manage that cost the best they can.
Okay. Does the fact that inclusionary zoning must be voluntary in New Hampshire help or hurt the creation of naturally occurring affordable housing?
Well, for those who don't know, inclusionary zoning is a zoning tool that municipalities can use so that when they permit new construction, often multifamily, but not always, they say, okay, well, you want to get this density bonus, then you're going to have to make 10% of your units affordable. And as of right now, it must be voluntary, meaning the municipality has to and can offer density bonuses, essentially, allow you to build more units on a given site. If you promise affordability, they can't say, if you want a building permit, you're going to have to do 10% affordability. Does it help or hurt it? You may have been able to tell that I was stalling. I don't really know. I don't think it's made a huge difference so far because there's probably not a lot of municipalities that would have elected to impose mandatory inclusionary zoning if it were allowed by state law.
Okay, well, that, Rob and Greg, brings us to the top of the hour. So I want to thank you both. Rob Dappis is the Executive Director of New Hampshire Housing. Greg Chakmakis is a shareholder at Sheehan Finney. Sheehan Finney and New Hampshire Housing were our sponsors today. We appreciate everybody who turned out for the webinar, all your great questions. I'm sorry for the ones that we weren't able to get to, but we hope to be back again before too long. So with that, thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.